The evening air was thick with humidity as Sarah Mitchell walked through the dimly lit parking garage beneath the downtown shopping complex. Her sneakers made soft squeaking sounds against the polished concrete floor as she headed toward her car, a small silver Honda Civic parked in the far corner. At 47 years old, Sarah carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from decades of discipline and training, though most people who saw her would simply notice a middle-aged woman with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing comfortable jeans and a navy blue sweater. The shopping bags in her hands contained groceries and a few items she had picked up for her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment next door. Sarah had made it a habit to check on the older woman regularly, especially since Mrs. Chen's husband had passed away 6 months earlier. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture that came naturally to Sarah, rooted in the same sense of duty and care for others that had driven her through 25 years of military service. As she approached her car, Sarah noticed a young man leaning against a massive pickup truck parked nearby. He appeared to be in his early 20s, with a buzz cut and the kind of muscular build that suggested regular physical training. Even in civilian clothes, there was something about his posture and bearing that screamed military. Sarah had seen enough young Marines in her time to recognize one even out of uniform. The young man, whose name was Jake Morrison, was having what appeared to be an intense phone conversation. His voice echoed slightly in the concrete space, and Sarah could hear fragments of his words as she fumbled in her purse for her keys. "I don't care what she says, Mom. I earned this leave, and I'm not cutting it short for anyone," Jake was saying into his phone, his tone sharp with frustration. "She can handle her own problems for once." Sarah minded her own business, focusing on locating her keys among the various items in her purse. She had learned long ago that other people's family drama was not her concern unless someone was in danger. However, as she finally found her keys and approached her car door, she accidentally bumped into Jake's extended arm as he gestured while talking. "Hey, watch it!" Jake snapped, turning toward her with an aggressive expression. The phone call had clearly put him in a foul mood, and Sarah's accidental contact seemed to trigger something in him. "Sorry about that," Sarah said calmly, taking a step back and raising her free hand in a peaceful gesture. "Didn't mean to bump into you." But Jake was already worked up from his phone conversation, and the combination of stress, anger, and perhaps too many drinks at the bar he had just left created a perfect storm of poor judgment. He ended his call abruptly and stepped closer to Sarah, his chest puffed out in an intimidating manner. "You think you can just walk into people and act like nothing happened?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "Where I come from, people show respect." Sarah remained calm, her expression neutral as she assessed the situation. She could smell alcohol on his breath, which explained part of his aggressive behavior, but she also recognized the signs of someone who was using intimidation as a way to vent frustration about something else entirely. "I apologized," Sarah said evenly. "It was an accident. No harm done." "No harm done?" Jake laughed harshly. "You don't get to decide that. You think because you're some soccer mom that you can just do whatever you want?" The comment about being a soccer mom might have been amusing to Sarah under different circumstances. She had never been married, never had children, and had spent her entire adult life in service to her country. But she kept that information to herself, continuing to project calm while internally preparing for the possibility that this situation might escalate beyond words. "Look, I really am sorry I bumped into you," Sarah said, taking another small step back toward her car. "I was just trying to get to my vehicle. How about we both go our separate ways?" But Jake seemed determined to make this into a bigger confrontation than it needed to be. The alcohol, combined with whatever family issues he had been discussing on the phone, had lowered his inhibitions and clouded his judgment. He stepped even closer to Sarah, now invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "I don't think you understand the situation here," Jake said, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "I'm a United States Marine. I've been trained to handle threats, and, right now, you're looking like a threat to me." Sarah almost smiled at the irony of his statement, but she kept her expression neutral. She had encountered plenty of young servicemen over the years who thought their training made them invincible, and she knew that trying to reason with someone in Jake's current state would likely be futile. "I'm not a threat to anyone," Sarah said quietly. I'm just trying to go home. Yeah, well, maybe next time you'll watch where you're going, Jake said, reaching out to grab her shoulder in what appeared to be an attempt to emphasize his point through physical intimidation. It was at that moment that Sarah's training kicked in, not because she felt threatened by Jake's actual ability to harm her, but because she recognized that allowing him to put his hands on her would only escalate the situation further. Her response was swift, precise, and completely proportional to the threat he posed. Sarah sidestepped Jake's reaching hand with fluid grace, simultaneously using her free hand to redirect his momentum in a way that sent him stumbling sideways. To anyone watching, it would have looked like Jake had simply lost his balance, but the young Marine found himself suddenly off balance and confused about what had just happened. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, steadying himself against his truck. The alcohol in his system made it difficult for him to process exactly how he had ended up stumbling when he had been the one making the aggressive move. "Look, Marine," Sarah said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone now, one that carried just a hint of authority. "You've had a few drinks, you're upset about something that has nothing to do with me, and you're about to make some choices that you're going to regret tomorrow. Why don't you call a cab, go home, and sleep it off?" But Jake's pride was now wounded on top of everything else. The idea that this middle-aged woman had somehow made him look foolish was more than his ego could handle. He pushed himself off his truck and faced her again, this time with his fists clenched. "You think you're tough?" he demanded. "You think you can embarrass a Marine and just walk away?" Sarah sighed inwardly. She had hoped to de-escalate the situation, but Jake seemed determined to learn his lesson the hard way. She set her shopping bags down carefully next to her car and turned to face him fully, her stance relaxed but balanced. "I think you're drunk and upset about something that has nothing to do with me," she said calmly. "And I think you're about to make this situation much worse for yourself if you don't walk away right now." The parking garage was nearly empty at this time of evening, with only the distant sound of traffic from the street above breaking the silence. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between the concrete pillars, creating an almost theatrical setting for the confrontation that was brewing. Jake took her calm demeanor as a sign of weakness rather than strength. In his alcohol-impaired judgment, he saw a woman who was trying to act tough but would crumble the moment he showed her what real strength looked like. It was a miscalculation that would prove to be both embarrassing and educational. "You want to see what happens when you mess with a Marine?" Jake asked, rolling his shoulders and taking a fighting stance that he had learned in basic training. Sarah watched his movements with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades studying combat techniques. She could see the flaws in his stance, the telegraphing of his intentions, and the way alcohol had affected his balance and coordination. More importantly, she could see that he was committed to this course of action despite her attempts to give him an escape route. "Last chance," Sarah said quietly. "Walk away, and we can both pretend this never happened." Jake's response was to swing a wild punch toward her face, putting all his weight behind what he clearly thought would be a devastating blow. To him, this was going to be a quick demonstration of superior strength and training that would put this uppity woman in her place once and for all. Sarah moved with the kind of fluid precision that comes from decades of training and real-world experience. She slipped the punch easily, allowing Jake's momentum to carry him past her while she positioned herself for what came next. Her counter was swift and educational rather than brutal, a perfectly executed armbar that leveraged Jake's own motion against him. In less than 3 seconds, Jake found himself face down on the concrete floor of the parking garage with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that caused significant discomfort without actual injury. Sarah's knee was pressed lightly against his back, and her grip on his wrist was firm enough to make it clear that any attempt to struggle would result in considerably more pain. "What the fuck?" Jake gasped, his face pressed against the cold concrete. What did you do?" Sarah maintained her hold on him while she spoke, her voice calm and instructional rather than angry or vindictive. "What I did was use your momentum and aggression against you. It's a basic principle that every competent fighter learns early in their training." Jake tried to struggle, but Sarah adjusted her grip slightly, applying just enough pressure to make it clear that resistance would be both futile and painful. The young Marine found himself completely immobilized by someone he had dismissed as no threat whatsoever. "This isn't possible," Jake muttered, his voice muffled by his position.
I'm a Marine. I've been trained for combat.
Yes, you mentioned that, Sarah replied dryly. And your training clearly covered the basics of hand-to-hand combat. Unfortunately, it apparently didn't cover the importance of not picking fights with strangers in parking garages while you're intoxicated. The humiliation of being taken down so easily by a middle-aged woman was starting to penetrate through Jake's alcohol-clouded thinking. Everything he thought he knew about his own capabilities and the nature of physical confrontation was being challenged by his current position on the concrete floor. "Let me up," Jake demanded, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments earlier. "I'll let you up when I'm convinced that you understand this situation has reached its conclusion," Sarah said calmly.
Are you going to continue trying to fight me, or are you ready to walk away like I suggested 5 minutes ago?
Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what had happened. He was supposed to be the trained fighter here. He was the one with military training and physical conditioning.
The woman holding him down should have been easy prey for someone with his background.
Yet here he was, completely helpless and at her mercy. "I don't understand how you did that," Jake admitted, his voice now carrying a note of confusion rather than aggression.
"I imagine there are quite a few things you don't understand right now," Sarah replied. "But the most important thing for you to understand is that this confrontation is over. You picked a fight with the wrong person, you lost, and now you get to learn from that experience." She released his arm and stepped back, giving Jake room to get to his feet. He rolled over and sat up slowly, rubbing his shoulder where Sarah had applied pressure. His face was flushed with embarrassment as much as exertion, and he couldn't quite meet her eyes as he struggled to reconcile what had just happened with his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "Who are you?" Jake asked as he finally stood up, brushing concrete dust off his clothes. Sarah picked up her shopping bags and walked toward her car, not bothering to turn around as she answered. "Someone who was just trying to go home with her groceries." The parking garage fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's car door opening and closing. Jake stood there for several minutes, staring at the spot where he had been taken down, trying to figure out how a routine bit of intimidation had gone so wrong so quickly. As Sarah drove out of the parking garage, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw Jake still standing there, apparently lost in thought. She hoped the experience would teach him something valuable about making assumptions and picking fights with strangers. In her experience, the best lessons were often the most humbling ones. The drive home gave Sarah time to reflect on the encounter. It had been years since she had needed to use her training in a civilian setting, and she found herself grateful that Jake's aggressive behavior had been fueled more by alcohol and poor judgment than by any real malicious intent. The situation could have been much worse if he had been truly dangerous rather than simply drunk and stupid. By the time she reached her apartment building, Sarah had already put the incident behind her. She had groceries to put away, a neighbor to check on, and a life to live that had nothing to do with educating young Marines about the dangers of making assumptions. She had no way of knowing that Jake Morrison would not be able to put the encounter behind him quite so easily, or that their paths would cross again under very different circumstances. Jake Morrison spent the rest of that evening sitting in his truck in the parking garage, staring at the concrete where he had been so thoroughly humiliated. The alcohol was slowly wearing off, replaced by a sobering mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and wounded pride. Everything he thought he knew about himself and his capabilities had been challenged in those few seconds when the middle-aged woman had put him on the ground with what seemed like minimal effort. For the past 3 years, ever since graduating from Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island, Jake had carried himself with the confidence that came from knowing he was a trained warrior. His drill instructors had hammered into him the belief that Marines were the finest fighting force on the planet, and his subsequent training had only reinforced that sense of superiority. He had completed his combat training with distinction, served a deployment overseas, and returned home with the unshakable belief that he could handle himself in any physical confrontation. That belief had just been shattered by a woman who looked like she could be somebody's mother. Jake finally started his truck and drove home to his small apartment, but sleep proved elusive. He lay in bed replaying the encounter over and over, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The woman had moved so smoothly, so effortlessly, that it was almost like she had known what he was going to do before he did it. Her technique had been flawless, and her control over the situation had been absolute from the moment she decided to act.
The next morning, Jake woke up with a headache that had nothing to do with the alcohol he had consumed the night before. He called his buddy Marcus, another Marine who had served with him overseas, and tried to describe what had happened without sounding like a complete fool. "So let me get this straight," Marcus said over the phone, clearly struggling not to laugh.
"You picked a fight with some random lady in a parking garage, and she took you down?"
"It wasn't like that," Jake protested, though even as he said it, he realized that was exactly what it had been like. "I mean, yeah, that's what happened, but there was something different about her.
She wasn't just some random lady." "What do you mean?"
Marcus asked, his tone becoming more serious. Jake struggled to put into words what he had sensed about the woman during their brief encounter. "The way she moved, the way she stayed calm even when I was getting aggressive, the way she handled me, it was like she'd done it before."
"A lot. You think she had training?" "I think she had more training than we do," Jake admitted reluctantly.
"But that's impossible, right?
I mean, where would a middle-aged civilian woman get that kind of training?"
Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. "There are plenty of places. Martial arts schools, self-defense classes, maybe she's got law enforcement background.
Or
what?
Or maybe she's not as civilian as you think."
That conversation planted a seed in Jake's mind that grew over the following days. He found himself thinking about the woman constantly, trying to piece together clues from their brief encounter. Her calm demeanor under pressure, the precision of her movements, the way she had spoken to him with authority even before the physical confrontation began, all of it suggested someone with significant training and experience. 3 days later, Jake made a decision that would change both of their lives. He returned to the parking garage where the encounter had taken place, not because he wanted a rematch, but because he hoped to find some answers. He sat in his truck and waited, reasoning that if the woman shopped at that complex regularly, she might return around the same time. His patience was rewarded when he saw the familiar silver Honda Civic pull into the garage. Jake watched as the woman, Sarah, though he didn't know her name yet, parked and headed toward the elevator that led to the shopping levels above. This time, instead of confronting her, Jake followed at a distance. Sarah went about her shopping with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed in their previous encounter. She moved through the grocery store methodically, checking items off a list and occasionally selecting additional items that caught her attention. Jake observed her from several aisles away, trying to understand what it was about her that had allowed her to handle him so easily. It was while watching her interact with the elderly security guard near the store entrance that Jake noticed something significant. The way Sarah spoke to the older man, the respectful attention she paid to his stories about his grandchildren, the subtle way she positioned herself to keep an eye on the store's exits while maintaining the conversation, all of it suggested someone with training in situational awareness and threat assessment. When Sarah finished her shopping and returned to the parking garage, Jake was waiting by her car. This time, however, his approach was completely different. Gone was the aggressive posturing and alcoholic bravado. Instead, he stood at a respectful distance with his hands visible and his demeanor clearly non-threatening. "Ma'am," Jake said as Sarah approached her vehicle, causing her to stop and assess the situation.
"I'm the Marine from the other night.
Jake Morrison." Sarah studied him for a moment, noting the significant change in his behavior and presentation.
"I remember.
What can I do for you, Jake?"
"I wanted to apologize," Jake said, his voice sincere. "What I did the other night was completely out of line.
I was drunk, I was angry about something that had nothing to do with you, and I took it out on an innocent person. That's not who I was raised to be, and it's not who the Marine Corps trained me to be." Sarah nodded slightly, acknowledging his apology without immediately accepting or rejecting it.
"Apology noted. Is there something else?"
Jake took a deep breath before continuing. "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be straight with me."
"Who are you?"
"I'm someone who is trying to go home with her groceries," Sarah replied, echoing her response from their first encounter.
"That's not what I mean," Jake said.
"The way you handled me the other night, the way you moved, the way you stayed calm, that wasn't luck, and it wasn't some basic self-defense class."
"You knew exactly what you were doing."
Sarah remained silent, waiting to see where Jake was going with his line of questioning. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, Jake continued.
I've been trained in hand-to-hand combat, I've served overseas, I thought I knew what I was capable of. But, you took me apart like I was a complete amateur. How?
The parking garage was quiet around them, with only the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional sound of a car starting somewhere on another level. Sarah weighed her options carefully before responding. What makes you think you deserve an answer to that question? She asked. Jake was prepared for that response.
Because I think you have something to teach me, and I think I need to learn it.
I've been carrying myself like I'm hot shit because I'm a Marine, and you showed me how wrong I was about that.
If there's more to learn, I want to know about it.
Sarah studied the young man's face, looking for signs of the anger and aggression that had characterized their first meeting. What she saw instead was genuine humility and a desire to understand something that had challenged his worldview.
What's your MOS? Sarah asked, using the military acronym for Military Occupational Specialty.
0311, Infantry, Jake replied, surprised by the question.
How did you, wait, are you military? Sarah didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked another question. How long have you been in?
3 years.
Did my first deployment to Afghanistan last year. And, in those 3 years, how many hand-to-hand combat instructors have you had? Jake thought for a moment.
Maybe 4 or 5, counting boot camp and advanced training.
Male or female? All male. Sarah nodded as if this confirmed something she had suspected. And, how many of those instructors do you think could have handled you the way I did the other night? Jake considered the question seriously. Most of them, probably.
They had years of experience and training beyond what I've got.
So you understand that superior training and experience can overcome youth and physical strength? Yeah, I guess so. Then, why is it so hard for you to believe that someone who looks like me might have that kind of training and experience? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He realized that his assumptions about Sarah had been based entirely on her appearance, her age, her gender, her civilian clothing, rather than on any actual assessment of her capabilities. Because I made assumptions, Jake admitted quietly. I saw a middle-aged woman and assumed she couldn't be a threat. And that assumption almost got you hurt, Sarah pointed out.
If I had been an actual threat instead of just someone trying to go home, your prejudices could have gotten you killed. They stood in silence for several moments while Jake processed this lesson. Finally, he looked up at Sarah with a mixture of respect and curiosity.
Will you tell me who you are? He asked. I'm not asking because I think I deserve to know. I'm asking because I think I need to understand how wrong I was. Sarah considered the request for a long moment.
There were many reasons to simply walk away and leave Jake to figure things out on his own. But she also recognized something in the young Marine that reminded her of her younger self, the desire to learn, to improve, to become better than who you were yesterday.
My name is Sarah Mitchell, she said finally. And, yes, I have military training. What branch? Navy. Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. Navy? But, the way you fought. You think sailors don't learn hand-to-hand combat? Sarah asked with a slight smile. Well, no, but...
Jake struggled to articulate his thoughts. I mean, the Navy isn't really known for that kind of training. Most of the Navy isn't, Sarah agreed.
But, some parts of it are. Understanding began to dawn on Jake's face. What was your rate? Your job in the Navy? Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. I was a SEAL.
The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He stared at Sarah in shock, his mind reeling as he tried to reconcile the middle-aged woman standing in front of him with what he knew about the Navy SEALs. That's impossible, Jake said automatically.
Women can't be SEALs. Women can't be SEALs now, Sarah corrected.
But, the rules have changed over the years, and there were some special circumstances during my time in service. Jake's worldview was crumbling and rebuilding itself in real time. Everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy, about the relative toughness of different branches, about women in combat, was being challenged by this quiet revelation.
How long? He asked. 25 years.
The number hung in the air between them like a physical presence. 25 years as a Navy SEAL was an almost unimaginable career, representing a level of experience and expertise that Jake was only beginning to comprehend.
Jesus Christ, Jake whispered. 25 years. And I tried to fight you.
Yes, you did, Sarah agreed.
And now you know why that was such a bad idea. Jake ran his hands through his hair, still struggling to process the information. Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you just say who you were?
Because I shouldn't have had to, Sarah replied.
The fact that I'm a veteran doesn't make what you did any more wrong than it already was. You attacked a stranger in a parking garage. It doesn't matter if that stranger was a civilian or a veteran or anyone else.
It was wrong regardless. The lesson was clear, and Jake understood it on a level deeper than mere intellectual comprehension. His actions had been wrong not because of who Sarah was, but because of what those actions represented about his character and judgment.
You're right, Jake said. And I'm sorry.
Not just for attacking a SEAL veteran, but for attacking anyone.
Sarah nodded, acknowledging his understanding.
That's a start.
Is there? Jake hesitated before continuing. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Sarah considered the question carefully. You can learn from this experience. You can think about what led you to make such poor choices that night, and you can work to make sure it doesn't happen again.
I will, Jake promised.
But, is there something more? Something I can do for you? Sarah was about to decline when an idea occurred to her. Actually, there might be something.
What?
You said you want to learn. Are you serious about that, or are you just trying to make yourself feel better about what happened?
I'm serious, Jake replied without hesitation.
Whatever you can teach me, I want to learn it.
Sarah looked at the young Marine for a long moment, seeing past his earlier arrogance to the potential beneath.
All right. But, if I'm going to teach you anything, we do this my way.
No ego, no assumptions, no shortcuts.
Can you handle that?
Jake straightened his shoulders in a gesture that was purely military.
Yes, ma'am. Good, Sarah said. Because you're about to learn what real training looks like.
The old gymnasium on the outskirts of town had seen better days. The paint on the walls was faded and peeling, the hardwood floors bore the scuffs and scratches of decades of use, and the fluorescent lights hummed with the irregular rhythm of fixtures that should have been replaced years ago. But, for Sarah Mitchell, it was perfect. The space was large enough for training, private enough for honest conversation, and cheap enough to rent for extended periods without drawing unwanted attention. Jake Morrison arrived at the gym 20 minutes early for their first training session, partly out of nervousness and partly out of ingrained military discipline. He had spent the past week thinking about Sarah's offer to teach him, wondering what he was getting himself into and whether he was truly ready for what she might have to show him. When Sarah arrived precisely at the scheduled time, she was dressed in simple workout clothes, black athletic shorts, a gray t-shirt, and well-worn training shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail, and she carried a small gym bag that Jake suspected contained more than just water and a towel. Before we begin, Sarah said without preamble, I want to make sure you understand what this is and what it isn't. This isn't therapy for your wounded ego. This isn't a way for you to get bragging rights about training with a SEAL. This is education, and education requires honesty about your current capabilities and limitations. Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant by that last statement. Strip down to shorts and a t-shirt, Sarah instructed.
Then, show me what you think you know about hand-to-hand combat.
Jake changed clothes and took a basic fighting stance in the center of the gym. He demonstrated the techniques he had learned in Marine Corps training, basic punches, kicks, and defensive maneuvers that were designed to be effective in close-quarters combat situations. Sarah watched silently, occasionally asking him to repeat certain movements or to explain the reasoning behind particular techniques. When he finished his demonstration, she stood quietly for a moment before speaking. What you've shown me is competent basic training, she said finally. It's designed to give you functional skills quickly, which is appropriate for the Marine Corps mission.
But, it's also limited in ways that you probably don't realize. What do you mean? Jake asked.
Instead of answering directly, Sarah moved to the center of the gym and took a stance that looked deceptively casual.
"Attack me," she said simply. Jake hesitated. "Are you sure?"
"Jake, I'm a 47-year-old woman who just spent 25 years learning how to handle people who are younger, stronger, and more aggressive than you.
I think I can manage."
Jake approached cautiously this time, having learned from their previous encounter. He threw a careful jab towards Sarah's midsection, expecting her to block or dodge. Instead, she moved in a way that seemed to make his punch miss while simultaneously putting her in position to control his arm. What followed was a brief but educational demonstration of the difference between basic military training and advanced combat expertise. Sarah moved with fluid precision, redirecting Jake's attacks and putting him in compromising positions without ever seeming to exert significant effort. Within 30 seconds, Jake found himself on the floor again, though this time the takedown had been gentler and more controlled.
"The difference," Sarah said as she helped Jake to his feet, "is in the depth of understanding.
You've learned techniques, which is good. But you haven't learned the principles behind those techniques, which means you can't adapt when the situation changes." She spent the next hour breaking down the fundamentals of leverage, timing, and positioning that formed the foundation of effective combat. Unlike the rapid-fire instruction Jake was used to from military training, Sarah's teaching style was methodical and patient, ensuring that he understood each concept before moving on to the next. "The goal isn't to overpower your opponent," Sarah explained as she demonstrated a technique that used Jake's own momentum against him. "The goal is to make their strength irrelevant. Someone who weighs 50 pounds more than you can still be defeated if you understand how to use their weight against them." As the weeks passed, their training sessions became a regular routine. 3 times a week, Jake would meet Sarah at the old gym, and she would systematically dismantle and rebuild his understanding of combat. But the lessons went far beyond physical techniques. "You're thinking about this wrong," Sarah said during one session after Jake had grown frustrated with his inability to execute a particular maneuver. "You're treating each technique like it's separate from everything else. Real combat isn't a series of isolated movements. It's a flowing conversation where each action influences what comes next." "I don't understand," Jake admitted. Sarah demonstrated by having Jake attack her with a simple straight punch. As his fist moved toward her, she showed him how her initial defensive movement opened up multiple follow-up options, each of which would lead to different outcomes depending on how Jake responded. "See? Your punch isn't just a punch. It's a question. My defense isn't just a block. It's an answer that asks another question. The winner is the person who can think furthest ahead in the conversation." This philosophical approach to combat was unlike anything Jake had encountered in his military training. The Marine Corps had taught him to be aggressive, direct, and overwhelming. Sarah was teaching him to be thoughtful, adaptive, and efficient. "Why wasn't I taught this in the Marines?" Jake asked during one of their water breaks. "Because the Marine Corps has different priorities," Sarah explained. "They need to take civilians and turn them into effective fighters quickly. The training you received is designed to work in most situations against most opponents. What I'm teaching you is designed to work in all situations against any opponent." "Is this what SEAL training was like?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "SEAL training is different for everyone because the missions are different. Some SEALs focus on underwater operations, some on direct action, some on reconnaissance. But the underlying principle is the same: you're taught to think, not just react." As Jake's skills improved, Sarah began to share more stories from her own experience. She told him about operations in places he had never heard of, challenges that required thinking outside the conventional military playbook, and situations where split-second decisions had life-or-death consequences. "I was part of a joint task force in Somalia," Sarah said during one training session. "We were supposed to extract a high-value target from a compound in Mogadishu, but the intelligence was wrong. Instead of one target, we found 12 hostages and a booby-trapped building." "What did you do?" Jake asked, genuinely curious.
We adapted. The original plan was worthless, so we had to create a new one on the fly.
That's what real training prepares you for, not following a script, but writing a new one when the old one doesn't work. These stories gave Jake insight into a level of military service that was completely different from his own experience. While his deployment to Afghanistan had been challenging, it had also been relatively straightforward: clear objectives, defined rules of engagement, and extensive support from command structures.
How do you learn to think like that? Jake asked. Practice, Sarah said simply.
Lots of practice in situations where there's no right answer, only better and worse options.
During their training sessions, Sarah began to incorporate scenarios that required Jake to think beyond pure physical technique.
She would create complex situations where the obvious solution was wrong, forcing him to consider multiple variables and potential outcomes.
You're in a crowded marketplace, Sarah said during one exercise.
You've identified a threat, but there are civilians everywhere.
You can't use your weapon without risking innocent lives. What do?
Jake thought through the scenario, considering various options and their potential consequences. I try to isolate the threat somehow, get him away from the civilians.
How? I'm not sure. Create a distraction? What kind of distraction? And what if the threat doesn't take the bait? What if he realizes what you're doing and decides to hurt civilians out of spite?
These exercises forced Jake to think several steps ahead, considering not just immediate tactical problems but also the second and third order.